And we are now going international with Stephen Donziger, who is a New York lawyer who has for many years, actually decades, represented people in Ecuador fighting Texaco Chevron over the enormous oil spills and other environmental disasters that Chevron has wrought there. And he will play us a little clip at the beginning and will then give us a presentation about the case, which also has quite interesting ramifications here in the United States.
What some environmentalists call the world's worst oil-related disaster.
My name is Stephen Donziger. I was there in Ecuador when indigenous groups and Amazon communities were fighting Chevron in an epic battle for justice. My first trip to Ecuador was in April of 1993. I went down with some lawyers and scientists to investigate reports that Texaco had dumped literally billions of gallons of toxic oil waste into the pristine Amazon rainforest where indigenous groups live. No one really knew what would happen as a result of the trip, but one thing that did happen is those who went on it all committed to trying to do something to address the problem and to help the people and to hold Texaco, now Chevron, accountable for what looked like a massive human rights problem that was done deliberately. On my first trip, I was shocked by what we found. I expected to see pollution. I was shocked by the extent of it. Massive pools of oil, literally thousands of them all over the rainforest. The oil was on their clothes, it was in the air they breathed, it was in the food they ate, it was in the water that they drank. It was an apocalyptic nightmare. During the first 10 years of the case, we were fighting to have a jury trial in the United States. Texaco and Chevron did not want that. They were petrified of a jury. They were desperate to shift the case back to Ecuador, where they would continue with their impunity. The case ended up getting shifted to Ecuador. On the very first day of the trial, in October of 2003, in Ecuador, after Chevron had agreed to accept jurisdiction there, literally the first thing they did was challenge jurisdiction. They accepted jurisdiction in the United States to get it to Ecuador. Then we got there and they're like, oh, you don't have jurisdiction over us. Chevron did not want any litigation on the merits of the claims of the Ecuadorians. They wanted to avoid that at all costs.
Yeah.
This is all the Chevron Texaco case.
You've read all of this?
¿Ya ha leído todo usted?
They were constantly filing dozens and dozens of trial motions in like a very short period of time, like an hour, to stop the court from functioning properly.
Eso abogado corrupto de Texaco.
Señor, usted va a responder por sus palabras.
Yo estoy respondiendo, señor. Usted es un abogado corrupto.
They basically have concluded that it's cheaper to pay hundreds of lawyers to fight this than to pay the people they harmed. Because once that happens once, the chances of it happening dozens more times increase dramatically, and their whole business model gets destroyed. It is a business model based on privatizing profits and socializing costs to the most vulnerable people on the planet. This case is about challenging that, ending it, holding it accountable. Which is why they are spending massive sums of money to try to destroy my life and hold me up as some sort of scalp that they can put on the walls of their homes like hunters put a moose head up. That's really what they want out of me. I am a human rights lawyer, detained in the United States of America on bogus charges to help a U.S. company evade a $10 billion environmental liability owed to the most vulnerable indigenous groups in the Amazon. And like, it's important not to get distracted by what's happening to any one individual, in this case me, because I'm in a difficult situation. It's important to understand that and to help me and to protect me and others like me. But we cannot preserve our planet for our children, for our grandchildren, for future generations, unless this work is done. I guess, am I supposed to speak now?
That's a yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Poggi and Professor Henry and all the students. It's a pleasure and honor to be invited. I'm also a big fan of Ralph Nader. I've been following him my whole life, and it's an honor to appear in the same class as Ralph. I hope I can add just a little bit, if I can add just, a small portion of the insight he just laid on you, I would be happy with this little talk. So thank you again for having me. The story I have to tell really relates to, pollution, the survival of the planet, indigenous rights, and the ability of people to avail themselves of the legal system to achieve justice when they're fighting intense and entrenched corporate power. In this case, Chevron, which through its predecessor company, Texaco, deliberately dumped billions of gallons of toxic waste in Ecuador. And one of the most critical points I want to emphasize about this story is that the pollution that I have spent a good portion of my professional life trying to remedy was put in Ecuador deliberately as a way to externalize the cost of production into the environment and into the surrounding communities from the company. So this is a classic case of privatizing profits, socializing costs. The impact on the indigenous peoples who lived in this area of Ecuador has been nothing short of devastating. Thousands have died of cancer and other oil-related diseases. And when our team of lawyers and advocates successfully held Chevron accountable in the courts of Ecuador, which is exactly where Chevron wanted to have the trial held, they then launched a vicious and ferocious retaliation attack against me and the leaders of the communities in Ecuador as a way to distract attention from what they did wrong and try to focus it on us and flip the narrative. And part of what they did is after we won the case in Ecuador, where in a court where they accepted jurisdiction, in a trial court decision that's been affirmed by 3 different appellate courts in Ecuador, including the Supreme Court of the country, they then came back up to New York, where our lawsuit originally was filed in 1993, to sue me personally, as well as the community leaders in Ecuador under the civil RICO statute, the racketeering statute, claiming the entire litigation in Ecuador, that I had worked on for, the bulk of my professional career was sham litigation, was bogus, and was merely a scheme designed by me and others to extort money from Chevron. That was their theory. And even though that theory to me was utterly preposterous, a US federal judge, Lou Kaplan, let Chevron pay a witness $2 million to walk into court in the United States in this civil case without a jury. There's no jury, just Judge Kaplan, former tobacco industry lawyer. And after being prepared and coached for 53 days prior to his testimony by Chevron lawyers, this witness came in and claimed that I had bribed or approved a bribe of the trial judge in Ecuador, and that the whole case therefore was a fraud. And this was completely false. The witness was paid. He later admitted lying. But on the basis of this testimony, Judge Kaplan found that I had attempted to bribe a trial judge in Ecuador. And he ruled that in the United States trial court that the whole case was a fraud. But what really happened here, and this is so interesting because I think this applies to the international taxation regime, where you have these imbalances of power. Judge Kaplan is a first level trial judge in the United States. Okay, think about that. He's just a trial judge. In Ecuador, we had the entire Supreme Court, the entire Constitutional Court affirm the judgment. So what you had is a low-level trial judge in the United States who purported to overrule Ecuador's highest court in order to try to nullify a legitimate judgment from a sovereign nation, democratic nation, and a US ally, such that Chevron could save money. And I think more broadly, the case could be used as a weapon of intimidation against human rights lawyers and against students like yourselves who might want to think about doing this kind of work. Subsequent to that decision, we kept going. We got a unanimous Supreme Court decision in our favor from Canada. And suddenly Chevron got all nervous, went back to Judge Kaplan, claimed that I was somehow violating his RICO judgment against me by continuing to work on the case and raise money for it. And Judge Kaplan ordered that I turn over all my internal case file information to Chevron, including my clients' names, our litigation strategy, et cetera, including my computer and cell phone. And by the way, I've never heard of this happening ever in the United States in history, where a judge orders a lawyer to turn over his case file to his adversary. Never happened. So when I appealed that order, and the appeal is still pending, Judge Kaplan charged me with criminal contempt of court. Again, this has never happened before in US history, that is a lawyer charged criminally over a legitimate litigation dispute that was taking place in court. He assigned the case to a close colleague who's a member of the Federalist Society, Loretta Preska. Chevron's a major donor to the Federalist Society, and she locked me up in my home on the 6th of August, 2019, and I'm still here. And the whole case is a misdemeanor, punishable by a maximum sentence in prison of 6 months. And I've been in my home over 18 months without a trial. I don't know what more to say. Maybe we can open it up for questions. Right now, I have an argument before the Second Circuit Court of Appeals on March 10th to get off home detention. I have a trial on May 10th, again without a jury. They will not give me a jury. And I believe that this is a violation of my constitutional rights and my human rights and international law rights. And I'll say one final thing is when Judge Kaplan charged me criminally, he was obligated by law to present the case to the United States Attorney in New York, the Southern District of New York, for them to prosecute me. And the office refused to prosecute me. So rather than just let it sit, he went out, Judge Kaplan, and appointed a private law firm and deputized them to act in the name of the US government to prosecute me. And this law firm, the name of which is Seward and Kissel, it turns out, has Chevron as a client. I'm being prosecuted by a private Chevron law firm, deprived of my liberty, and potentially sent to jail. So how the hell have we reached a point in our society, and Ralph Nader talked about corporate power, okay? How have we reached a point in our society where the government has given big oil the power to prosecute its main critic and deprive him of his liberty, as opposed to a professional prosecutor, who in my opinion never would have locked me up. But of course, that person saw the case and realized there wasn't a legitimate case. So they refused to take it. I will say this in closing, is that this is happening in my view because the communities in Ecuador have won the litigation. We are winning, we have won. This is kind of a last ditch effort by Chevron, which is part of the, an industry that's in significant structural decline, fossil fuel industry. Exxon lost over $20 billion last year. Chevron had its worst year in years last year. And they're angry. They don't like being held accountable. They've subsisted off of public subsidies for decades and decades. I believe they're fundamentally grifters, meaning they just take from the public. I mean, Ecuador is a perfect example. They designed the system to pollute, to save money, and they took out all the profits they could, and all the pollution's still there. It's killing people for decades. And when you go to court and play by the rules and actually win a case, they then sue you back and try to claim that they're the victim of the very people they poisoned in Ecuador and their lawyers, meaning me. By the way, the decision in 2014 in the racketeering case, Judge Kaplan was able to parlay that into my disbarment in New York without a hearing. I never had a hearing. They claimed that trial with no jury, where the paid witness testified falsely, was my due process for my bar license. So I've appealed that, but I don't no longer have my bar license in New York. And it was taken away without a hearing. So, you know, the deprivation of rights, of liberty is honestly scary as heck to watch, you know, even scarier still that it's me. I want to acknowledge up front that there's tons of activists and lawyers around the world who have it much, much worse than I do, you know, who got put in prison or murdered for speaking truth to power. However, I will say for the United States of America, what's happening to me, as far as we can tell, has never happened before. There's never been a lawyer who has spent even one day in pretrial detention on a criminal contempt charge prior to me. And I've been here over 550 days.
I just asked, do you have a lawyer? And has the ACLU been, I mean, obviously I heard about you first from Amnesty US, Barbara Spruill, who but what's your experience with getting effective representation here and also getting a political representatives in Washington or anywhere else to, or the UN, for example, to hear your case?
Well, we're working all those fronts, but you know, on every one we're somewhat out-resourced because Chevron just throws its lobbyists in there and then they take Kaplan's decision out and try to demonize me. But I've had good experiences with lawyers. I mean, Ron Kuby's my lawyer, Rick Friedman, Marty Garbus, everybody working pro bono, Lauren Regan from the Civil Liberties Defense Center in Oregon. You know, the congressional piece, there was a letter that's going into the Biden administration signed by Amnesty International and 12 other NGOs this week, demanding my case be dismissed. You know, remember I mentioned that Kaplan appointed a private law firm to prosecute me. So there's something so extreme about this that our play right now is to urge the DOJ to take the case back from the private law firm and they can prosecute me. And then we can have an actual discussion about how to resolve it, you know, without me going to jail and without there even being a trial, because I don't believe these charges are justified. So, you know, we're working the halls of Congress, but, you know, I was invited to speak in the European Parliament. I did last summer, and they then wrote a letter to Jamie Raskin, who, of course, at the time he received the letter, wasn't quite as well known as he is today. And Jim McGovern, who's, you know, prominent, progressive thinking, you know, representatives. And we're hoping they'll do something. But, you know, without a public outcry and without action in Congress, these judges have calculated that they can get away with this.
Stephen, can you add a little bit about what would have happened if the judgment in Ecuador had been enforced? Would the money have been spent on cleanup, or would the money have just been given to people who you were representing, or how would the story have gone on, or how might it still go on if the judgment does eventually get enforced?
So any monies collected, and the judgment's around $9.5 billion, go to a trust fund under the control of the affected communities. And out of that, they would hire technical advisors to spend the money appropriately on environmental cleanup. The case, because of various limitations in Ecuadorian procedural law, it was not about personal injuries. So the people affected will not be getting personal money under our theory of the case. But there will be a significant amount of money to mitigate health impacts, provide clean water, and to try to, you know, again, mitigate the horrendous environmental impacts that have really decimated several indigenous cultures. So I don't know, I hope that answers your question. The money will not be going into people's pockets.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, can Judge Kaplan be charged under the RICO statute?
Well, look, in an objective, just world, I think what he has done might qualify as a RICO violation. But, you know,
The authorities wouldn't look at that.
I mean, you know, prosecutors do not charge judges. Judges enjoy immunity unless it's a really egregious kind of thing, which
This is pretty damn egregious.
this case is.
Let me ask if Ralph is still on the line, if he'd like to comment on.
I was going to ask Steve, any attempt to bring him before the Judicial Discipline Board of New York State to highlight what he's done? I mean, he's the Chevron version of a hanging judge.
Yeah.
And it's surprising that there hasn't been more action on his conflicts of interest, his cronyism, his lack of judicial temperament, his dismissing contrary evidence, depriving you of due process. I can't imagine that he hasn't been brought up. You know, they have a history of going after, you know, more conventional judicial corruption like bribery and so on, and they have dismissed judges and they have prosecuted judges. But I suppose this is a federal judge, a federal or state?
Federal.
Huh?
Go ahead, Ralph. I'm sorry.
Is it federal? Is he a federal judge or state?
Federal.
Federal. Well, you know, there is a body, a governing body. I'm just, apart from its likelihood of success or not, has it been brought, has his behavior been brought to that body?
Well, this is what has been done. Hundreds of lawyers around the world wrote a 50-page misconduct complaint against him, which you can access online. It's on the website of the National Lawyers Guild and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, which is a UN-affiliated international legal group. A friend of mine took the lead in writing it from the IADL, and it's devastating. Now, that was submitted to the chief judge of the Second Circuit, which oversees Kaplan as a trial judge. They have a judicial complaint mechanism in the court. Every circuit has this. And they just basically get to police themselves. Okay, this was submitted last August, and there's been no action taken on it. There's not even been a notification to the people submitting it that it was received. And it's really clear there's a tremendous lack of accountability by these federal judges. It's really hard to get these lifetime appointed judges to, you know, to hold each other accountable. And if
well, what about the law firm? Name the law firm. The law firms are the most unscrutinized people for what they do to this country. I mean, they're the brains of these corporate criminals. So what law firm, anybody brought any of these lawyers up for discipline, regardless of the probability of success or not, because, you know, they cover for themselves, but at least it raises the issue and shifts some of the focus. What's the name of the law firm?
So the law firm prosecuting me is called Seward and Kissel, and they're a complete, you know, oil industry law firm. They have about 150 lawyers. I mean, they're not one of the larger firms, but they do a lot of transactional business in the industry, transportation and stuff. And it was very clear why Judge Kaplan appointed them. I mean, there's 1,000 disinterested former federal prosecutors in Manhattan and New York. He could have appointed any one of them. Why did he appoint the law firm that works for Chevron? You know, and the reason is he wanted to control the case. There's no separation of powers in this case. Kaplan is essentially acting as the, you know, executive, legislative, and judiciary in the same case. I mean, he charged me, he's prosecuting me, and he's essentially judging me. Even though he appointed Judge Preska to oversee the case, he hasn't recused himself, and he's still working with her. I have a two-headed judge on this case. So
what about suing him? What about suing him directly?
I think that's a great idea, but I have a really hard time finding lawyers willing to do that.
What about the professor at Harvard Law School that's helping you?
Oh, Charlie Nesson?
Yeah.
Yeah, Charlie, yeah. I mean, yeah. You know, to take on these behemoths requires a lot of legal skill and a lot of courage and resources. And the lawyers representing me are good, but this kind of creative take offense type of litigation is just, really hard to get people to do. I mean, it's crazy. I totally get what you're saying, and I get the validity of it. Maybe we could have an offline conversation, Ralph, about who might.
Yeah, well, you should contact Lou Goldfarb in Washington. You know him. He's legendary, taking on the power structure.
Yeah. But I mean, you're totally right. I mean, this kind of thing happens because there's not enough force or energy on the other side to call it out. I mean, even if you file a bar complaint and they don't rule on it, the reality is it's there and it causes consternation. It acts as a brake on their corruption. So I get what you're saying, and I think you're totally right.
I would just comment that in the work I've been doing in the Second Circuit on the Trump case and the corruption there, we've uncovered a case of judges in the Eastern District who have covered up a network of confidential informants. And they had two of the lawyers who surfaced this disbarred, and they've been fighting disbarment for the last 5 years. So it's very parallel to what you're experiencing in the same circuit. There seems to be a systemic problem in the Second Circuit, which we should pay some attention to. I'm happy to talk to you offline about that whole case.
I would love to. And the Second Circuit is its own animal. That's my experience. And what you just described, I mean, why is it that the lawyers who call out the corruption get disbarred? Think about that. Think about the message that sends. From the corporate powers that be that I find control the bar disciplinary process in Manhattan, where I dealing with that crowd. It's extraordinary, and there's there's an academic who teaches at William and Mary Law School I think his name is James Molatero, who's studied this from an academic standpoint over the last 100 years in America and really documented meticulously how the bar disciplinary process has been used for political purposes against those who take on powerful interests, corporate interests. I mean, from the days of the House Un-American Activities Committee, lawyers represented accused communists to, lawyers who are too aggressive on immigration issues. I mean, it's just amazing who gets disbarred, these days. It's sort of what you're talking about.
Enzo has a question.
Question from Enzo.
Yeah, so I have a question and also a comment as well. And thank you so much, Mr. Donziger, for speaking with us today. My question is regarding the fact that the judge appointed a private firm to prosecute you and whether there is any precedent in the US legal system for that. And my comment is just regarding the situation in Ecuador. I'm from Nigeria. I'm from the Niger Delta region in Nigeria. So I've also seen the devastation that can be caused by these oil corporations firsthand. And in my experience, they pay, the local communities a stipend basically. And these people, because of their situation, they can't really tell what's going on. So they accept whatever payments they get. They don't go through legal channels. They just go through the community leaders and they get paid a stipend. The environment is just completely ruined. Crops are dying, wildlife is just going basically into extinction at this point, and the government is not doing anything about it. And if we would refer to Nigerian history a little bit, in 1995, during the last dictatorship, there was the hanging of a community activist, a very famous environmentalist, and that basically sent a message to everybody in the region to not, protest against these foreign corporations or protest against the government. So I just wanted to, lay that out there.
Well, thank you for that, Enzo. I'm very familiar with that case, the Ken Saro-Wiwa case. And, that is an example of what they try to do. I mean, what they're doing to me, I think, is the same modality, right? I mean, they're trying to basically hold me up, just like they held him up, and use it to intimidate people who might think about taking on the industry. So, love to your country. I mean, I know the amount of oil pollution in Nigeria is just off the charts. It's very bothersome. But I will say that these companies like Shell and Chevron, that are able to sort of waltz around the world, go from Ecuador to Nigeria to Israel. I mean, Chevron just bought some offshore gas interests in Israel a few weeks ago, and the Israelis are just up in arms about why are we letting Chevron into our country when they lock up lawyers and pollute all over the world, And I think that the environmental movement needs to sort of think about ways to move its social capital around the world and prevent companies that commit these heinous acts and that do not comply with the rule of law from just showing up in a third country as if it's just an equal player ready to do business, a corporate citizen in good standing, And it's extraordinary the lack of kind of international corporate governance mechanisms out there to prevent companies like Chevron from operating anew in some other country when they're not even respecting court judgments where they polluted the heck out of another country, where people are still suffering. So as a movement, I think we need to sort of be more cognizant of the need to sort of, go around the world and move our environmental protest capital and our social capital around more fluidly.
Good. We have one more student question from Harrison.
Hi, yeah, sorry. I think this actually probably lends quite closely to what you're just saying, Ms. Donziger. What I think we discussed a lot in the past hour and a half or so about potential changes at the government level to influence these problems, but it seems like we're increasingly faced with sort of this corporatization thing, and I was wondering if there's anything we can do either at the international level or the sort of national level with regard to the corporations themselves, because if we were to start from the assumption that it's difficult to change the sort of state of affairs, is there any way we can influence the corporations that are then influencing policy, as it were? And yeah, I don't know if I'll leave it there or I could go on, I guess. But.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I mean, there's a lot of things going on in the world now where, investors and funds are really starting to move their capital away from fossil fuels into clean energy. And, that is a function, I think, of greater consciousness of the harms caused by the fossil fuel industry, but also just by pure economics. I mean, there's a lot of money to be made in clean energy now in ways that there weren't before. And, you saw Lawrence Fink's letter. He heads BlackRock, probably the biggest hedge fund in the world, investment fund in the world. And he's making noise about the environment. I think nothing short of a full-scale divestment from Chevron and some of these companies will, that would be one of the main things that I think has to happen to accelerate the move away from fossil fuels and the move towards saving our planet for future generations. There are mechanisms in the world to hold corporations accountable on an international level. There's international law, there's international judicial bodies, and Amnesty International has filed a petition on my behalf with a United Nations body. All of these things help, but I have to say my personal experience is they need to be strengthened considerably to be able to match up with the power of what I'm facing in terms of Chevron's law firm, Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher, the prosecuting Chevron law firm, Seward and Kissel, backed by these judges. And, it always amazes me. I don't know if Ralph is still on, but we litigated in Ecuador at Chevron's request. We initially filed the case in New York. They wanted it in Ecuador. They agreed to accept jurisdiction as a condition of it moving to Ecuador. So we had to pack up, go down to Ecuador, get a legal team together, invest a lot of time and money and effort. And once we started to put in evidence, they then claimed Ecuador's court system wasn't good enough for them. And they tried to turn the tables on that court system. And the cynicism and the forum shopping and the lack of, good faith is really disturbing. I mean, I guess I shouldn't be surprised. But what I am surprised about is the fundamental weakness of the federal judiciary in this country to enforce the rule of law when it comes to Chevron in this case. I mean, it's just, to me, it's inexcusable. All it would take is a judge in the proper position to really make the right noises about how this needs to be dealt with, because there's tens of thousands of people dying in Ecuador right now, indigenous groups being destroyed, the ecosystem being burned up. Just make those noises, and they, in my view, they would settle this case.
Ralph, did you have another comment? I think he's still on the line.
He just stepped away. He'll be right back.
Oh, okay, good. I was going to note that Ecuador just had a presidential election this week, and Moreno, I think, had shown himself in the Assange case to be pretty much at the beck and call of the U.S. Is the newly elected president likely to be more positive? Or is it possible that you could actually have Ecuador calling for justice at the UN in addition to on your behalf?
You know, possibly. I mean, my position is, you know, the Ecuador government really should have nothing to do with this case. It's a private civil litigation. You know, Chevron keeps trying to say, oh, the only reason you won is because Ecuador's president was behind you, you know, which is just hogwash. It's not true. You know, we won based on voluminous evidence.
Yeah, I'm back.
Yeah.
Jim, I'm back. Somebody wanted me.
Yeah, we were just wondering if you had any more comments on what the next steps here would be.
Yeah, my comment basically is the first problem is a lot of people like us, when they're confronted with a case like Steve's, they don't have time to go into the details. It's like any other civil liberties case, for example. They don't have where somebody's being railroaded, and so they got other things that they're doing and trying to do. But generally speaking, from what I know your case, Steve,
yeah,
you need to go on the offense. Chevron hasn't paid a price here. You need to go after the law firms. You need to try to get them before the disciplinary committee. Now, we know about these disciplinary committees, but they don't really like to have that on their record with, you know, a real petition. Now, a bunch of conservative lawyers just filed a disbarment motion, 50 pages against Giuliani. And it's full of detail. It took a lot of work. Rudy Giuliani. It's called Lawyers Defending Democracy, and it's just a new group that was formed during the run-up to the impeachment proceedings in Congress. And the same is true for the judge. Now, the same people who are helping you in your case, they don't have the temperament to go after a judge. You need different kinds of people to go after the judge. And so I will look around and see what's available. And, you know, Lou Goldfarb just put out a book called The Price of Justice. I mean, he's been involved in huge cases over the last 6-7 decades. And he's someone you should talk to at least. And I'll get his phone number to Jim, so you can, Jim, you can give him his phone number. He's in Washington, D.C. He's written all kinds of books and articles, and just look him up, Lou Goldfarb. He's got a, so that's what you need to open up different fronts so that you get on like 60 Minutes. You probably haven't been on any of these national TV programs, have you?
Well, I was on 60 Minutes in 2009, but the funny thing is once Kaplan ruled, it's like the major media won't cover me. It's the craziest shit. And I always got covered by the New York Times. I know a lot of and like the New York Times actually assigned a very well-known writer to do an in-depth piece about my situation. And he worked on it for 2 weeks and then they killed the story. And like, what's
Who was that?
William Langowicha from the magazine.
William who?
Langowicha.
Is he still there?
He's still there. He's at the magazine. He's a magazine writer. They're a big feature in the magazine. But, you know, I've talked to Clifford Crowd. I mean, it's just this weird thing. I mean, the New York Times appropriately covers victims of human rights abuses all over the world. You know, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. I'm a mile from headquarters, and they won't write a story about me. And my theory is Judge Kaplan and all the Chevron lawyers at Gibson Dunn and all the advertising money, they have enough juice to really put the brakes on stories about me. And I think it's been successful. I mean, I don't mean to be a conspiracy theorist. I don't think there's a rule you can't cover Steve Donziger. but like every time someone tries to write about it, like there's some reason why they don't want to do it. And, you know, I've had some great stories written about me by Chris Hedges in the Sheer Post, The Nation, The Intercept, Salon. I mean, you know, a bunch of independent media have written some pretty damn good stories, but, you know, the major media just, I've had a hard time breaking through over the last few years. I was on 60 Minutes in 2009.
Well, you know, the Times has a practice. They have their hates and their loves, you know, and they have certain taboos and certain subjects they won't cover, and other subjects they're ferocious on. And I don't know what the problem is in this one, because, you know, they had a big Amazon story and contamination of the Amazon, huge story a few months ago.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, we'll be in touch. We'll get you in touch with a number of people, Steve.
Jason Atkins, by the way, says hello. He's been a huge supporter of mine. We're still very close friends. So thank you.
Who is that?
Jason Atkins. You know Jason?
Oh, yeah, right, yeah.
Jason's one of my best friends. We were in the same law school class. And of course, I think I met you through him originally years ago. And Jason is sort of on my kitchen cabinet and helping a lot. Just wanted to let you know that.
Oh, good. Well, I'll talk to Jason. He's been in France for 2-3 years. I'll talk to him about that.
Tell him it's time to come home.
And we're trying to get him to come home. He likes the social services there.
Any more student questions, please?
So I'm not a student, but I've got one more question, which concerns potential bias in the American judicial system. So I don't know whether you are able to answer that sort of more or less statistically, but I can see two potential biases. One bias is sort of corporate interests over public interests. And another bias could be American clients versus, or litigants versus foreign litigants. There was a recent case in Sweden where a Swedish court had to deal with a case of bribery by a Swedish firm bribing people abroad, with people abroad being harmed. And the court kind of said, we are not really interested. You know, it's yeah, they did something illegal, but so long as the victims are foreigners, we don't really care. Do you see either of those two biases at work? And in your case, of course, both are potentially in play. And would you have any idea which one might be decisive or the weightier one in the particular case at hand?
Well, that's an insightful question. I think both of those biases are present in this case and present generally in these types of cases. I mean, for example, in the Second Circuit, which is, I think, a pretty conservative court because it's at the center of the financial power of the United States, New York. And, you know, there is for the last 20, 25 years, there's been kind of this steady march toward greater and greater hostility in this court against foreign plaintiffs, that is, people in other countries who have been victimized by American corporate misbehavior in those other countries. And you see this in the Bhopal case. I mean, I don't know, many of you are probably too young to remember the Union Carbide disaster in Bhopal, India. But the Second Circuit, there's been so many efforts to get that case into US courts. You know, Union Carbide is an American company. And the judges are just so hostile. Send it back to India, send it back to India. And, you know, the average payout for, a victim in India is like $3,000, whereas in the United States, it would be millions. You know, why does the court keep pushing that case out of the United States? And I think you see this in my case, where there's like this revulsion. I mean, they don't say this, it's just sort of in the air, where a lot of the judges here don't want an Ecuadorian court to be imposing big judgments on American companies. It's almost like a competition over who can have the most power, US courts or courts from another country, in this case, Ecuador. I mean, if these were English courts or French courts, I still think there'd be competition. But Ecuadorian courts, there's this, I would argue, this colonialist / racist mentality about courts in the South. In New York, like how people think about those courts. You know, the fact that an Ecuadorian court could issue a multi-billion-dollar judgment against an American company was just too much. You know, so I think the bias manifests itself, you know, in lots of different ways. And I also think, Thomas, that when you go to these federal appellate courts, you know, the majority of judges come out of the corporate law world or sort of what I would call a national security type prosecutorial job. Okay. You cannot find a full-time human rights law practitioner anywhere on the US federal bench. So when a human rights lawyer like me or others go into federal court, we are from the get-go, you know, fighting upstream, fighting the structure. And a lot of the judges just have no respect for this kind of work. You know, I mean, they're perfectly comfortable resolving commercial disputes between companies. But like anything that reeks of like, wait a second, you know, Chevron deliberately dumped 16 billion gallons of toxic waste. Thousands of people have died. Probably the most egregious environmental catastrophe on the planet ever related to oil, okay? And they just blow it off.
Steve, explain how they went after the judge. That seemed to have been the turning point in their nefarious strategy against you, the Ecuadorian judge.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I mean, this was their dilemma. Okay, we won the case, and we were going to go enforce it against their asset. They needed to come up with some spectacular story to convince judges in Canada and Brazil and wherever the Ecuadorians might go to seize Chevron's assets, that you can't seize it because a fraud happened. So none of this happened. What happened is after the trial, they just paid this Ecuadorian witness $2 million plus, moved his whole family to the United States. They pay his income taxes. They got him political asylum, and they coached him 53 days. And he came in and he claimed that he was in a meeting with me where I approved the bribe of a trial judge, and it was just totally false. Kaplan credited it, and he then pinned that on the trial judge in our case who issued the judgment, claiming that we had ghostwritten the judgment, which again did not happen. And a forensic examination of the judge's computer, you know, by an independent expert, actually Christopher Ratchett from Washington, D.C., found that there wasn't ghostwriting. It was written on the judge's computer, you know, from a Word document open and closed 484 times over 3 months. You know, so the lies are so blatant, you know, but Judge Kaplan uses his authority as a federal judge, gives his imprimatur. And a lot of people in America just like, who am I going to believe? It's, you know, as you said, Ralph, you know, about law and about the tax code. I mean, it's made so complicated so the average person can't get their arms around it, and therefore they're neutered from taking political action to change it. And like,
Steve, explain to the students why you couldn't get a jury trial when the 7th Amendment of the Constitution is supposed to guarantee you that.
So yeah, when you're sued in civil court for money, you're supposed to get a jury. So I was expecting a jury, preparing for a jury. Literally 2 weeks before the trial, Chevron dropped every penny of their damages claims just to avoid a jury. So Judge Kaplan, who had signaled to them he would rule in their favor, could decide the case alone. So I never got a jury. And, you know, they did that by dropping all the damages claims. And then when they predictably won the case, you know, based on this false testimony, Kaplan then had the gall to impose millions of dollars of court costs on me after the trial, literally millions. And he allowed Chevron to seize my bank account. So I never had my jury. I'm on the hook for millions of dollars of, I think, completely unjustified court costs. But it's sort of that legal maneuvering. It's what I would call trickery by these big corporate firms that allows these corporations to get away with it. And if you have a willing trial judge, as they did in this case, who was actually working with them and was encouraging them and feeding them ideas of how to do this. You know, he worked at Paul Weiss, by the way, Ralph. I don't know if you know, he represented Brown and Williamson for many years. Like, this guy knows all the book. And they just utterly steamrolled me. And once I didn't have a jury, there was nothing I really could do, except appeal.
Tell the students about the National Lawyers Guild and see if they helped you.
So the National Lawyers Guild is an organization, a network of lawyers, progressive lawyers in the United States. And, they have stepped up and written this, helped write this judicial misconduct complaint against Judge Kaplan. But there's, it's hard to mobilize people, Ralph. This is the other thing. People on the progressive left in the law sometimes get very confused. They're like, well, wait a second. What's up with this Donziger guy? Judge Kaplan had a trial, ruled against him. Are you sure about him? And all Chevron has to do is plant a little bit of uncertainty, a little bit of doubt. And then it makes it much, much harder to get people, to get lawyers to rally to my cause. I mean, they have sufficiently, I think a lot of people have rallied to my cause, including 55 Nobel laureates and hundreds, thousands of lawyers around the world. But you'd be surprised at those who have not rallied to my cause. And I think there's
Steve, the core is how they tainted the Ecuadorian judge as corrupt, and that's what you lance that boil, and you'll relieve a lot of the distancing of people who should know better from helping your case.
Yeah. But, isn't it interesting that, they charged me under civil RICO. By the way, I'm the only defendant ever under civil RICO who never got a jury in the history of the United States. And then they parlay that into a criminal contempt charge, and they're again denying me a jury. So, through a civil RICO case, it's really about supposed crimes I committed. I was not given a jury. Now they're actually charging me with criminal contempt. They're not giving me a jury, and I could end up in jail, with 2 trials with no juries. How does that happen in America? So there's all this tricked up stuff going on. It's just extraordinary to watch that they get away with it. And I can't even tell you, a lot of defense lawyers are like, well, that's how it works. All she has to say is she's not going to sentence you to more than 6 months in prison. You don't have a jury. I'm like, well, that's not how it's supposed to work. And you can still get a jury on a misdemeanor. So there's just this concerted effort, I think, to control the process in a way that I can't get a fair trial in the United States.
What's the name of the lead lawyer on who's your opponent here?
So there's 2 lead lawyers. The private prosecutor, her name is Rita Glavin, Glavin. By the way, Ralph, you might remember the Ted Stevens prosecution fell apart, 12 years ago. She was one of the lead prosecutors on that case and got reprimanded for her lack of ethics. And the other main lawyer is a guy named Randy Mastro, Mastro. He was Rudy Giuliani's deputy mayor. They're still very close. He's Giuliani's personal lawyer. And he's the guy who led the 100+ person legal team at Gibson Dunn trying to basically demonize and destroy me. I hope this doesn't sound too depressing.
It's actually a great challenge, I think, to the students about people putting their lives on the line. And, this is important work, but it doesn't come free. So
true, but I will say this, speaking personally, I never imagined that my life would be on the line for doing this work. And that might have been a little naive of me, who knows, but I never thought this could happen.
Well, we salute you. I think during the early part of the 20th century, there was a progressive movement which came out of a lot of revelations about corporate crime and injustice, and it led to quite a few progressive reforms. One of the things that we learned from that was that it was very helpful to have people like yourself able to communicate and speak out. Mm-hmm. So the idea of have you had an opportunity, do you think enough opportunity to have sessions like these with ordinary Americans around the country? I think people would, it's kind of like virtual Chautauqua, they're telling this story. I mean, Amnesty US has this big initiative to do human rights education. For me, this is human rights education. squared, you know, and this kind of story needs to be told.
Yeah. Well, I love speaking, and I speak, you know, a fair amount, but not enough. I'm speaking at Stanford Law next week on the 23rd. You know, I've spoken at many law schools, and, you know, I've spoken to the European Parliament, and, you know, but it's like, you know, if you get 40 people on a Zoom call, that's great, you know, especially Yale students, people of influence, but, you know, Chevron has a major megaphone. I mean, they just buy ads and can reach millions of people quite easily. But I mean, you know, we got to keep trucking and keep pushing. Yeah. If you have any ideas of invites or people who would want to hear my story,
well, we're having an Amnesty conference in March, an activist conference, which will get a few thousand people to hear about this. So you might be want to think about being on that. But anyway, Thomas.
That's me. So I think we have to wind up. We are a little bit over time, and I apologize for that. But I think it's been a fantastic session, and it will be all up on the YouTube channel of the Global Justice Program pretty soon. We make a nice little video out of this. Okay, so thanks to everybody for your participation, comments, questions. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Stephen, if Ralph is still with us.
Yep.
And we see you all in a week when our guest will be Jeff Sachs and, of course, Jim Henry.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you
very much.
Thank you,
Cheers,
Jim.
guys. Thank you, Steve.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ralph.
Thank you.